all them statements to Becky when I was working on it. And not want to do. There was an awful lot of research and study to try to find other evidence of what the age of the shroud is. And as I said before, I think that was God's purpose because he wanted people to dig deeper into it. And also I pointed out that God uses unbelievers to accomplish these things, because if believers do it, people are going to accuse them of bias and so on. But if it's people who are atheistic or agnostic or they hate God, and they're the ones who discover these things scientifically or whatever, then it carries much more weight. And so people began, therefore, to study the shroud, other areas of it, and try to establish whether or not they could go back past 1290 to show that the shroud existed before that time, which was the earliest date of the carbon-14 dating. And so they went all the way back to Jerusalem, and they knew about this legend of Abgar, King Abgar in Edessa. And so the historian Eusebius, who was well known as a church historian, as you see there in the 3rd century into the 4th century, he had written a good bit about it, what was known about King Abgar and the events in his life, and this what became known as the Edessa, the image of Edessa. And so the story had been that in Jesus' lifetime, King Abgar of Edessa had developed leprosy. And he had heard about Jesus in Israel and his healing abilities. And so he sent a letter. This is what the Eastern Orthodox Church teaches. I don't see any reason that it couldn't have been true. He sent a letter to Jesus asking him to come and heal him. But Jesus, of course, that was not part of what God had him doing. So he sent a message back to King Abgar saying to him that no, he would not be coming, but he would send somebody to him. And so interestingly, the messenger, one of the messengers, they had gone to Israel after the resurrection of Jesus, returned to Edessa with a cloth bearing the image of Jesus. Now keep in mind, something that's very important about that is, and why the gospel writers did not tell us exactly what John and Peter saw in the tomb regarding probably this image, is because at that time the teaching in Judaism was that you could not have icons or images of God. And so they knew that if that became widely known, that the Jews themselves would destroy it if they could get their hands on it. So therefore it's probable that whichever took it, John or Peter, and most people believe it was Peter that took it and did something with it, they would have concealed it and carefully guarded it. So that would make it reasonable that they would send it somewhere else. And according to tradition, they sent it to King Abgar in Edessa because he was a believer and it was important to him. They believed he'd protect it. So, therefore, supposedly, one of Jesus' disciples accompanied the messenger back to King Abgar. And it was Judah Thaddeus that we studied about recently. And it's known from secular history that Thaddeus was in that part of the world after Jesus' resurrection. So it sounds entirely feasible that the shroud was taken to him by his messenger along with Thaddeus who accompanied it. And so they went on to say that Abgar was miraculously healed of leprosy when he was given the shroud, the image of Edessa, which had the face of a man on it, and that he was miraculously healed and he became a Christian, a believer. Now, as time went by, his son, Abgar, died, and his son became the king of Edessa. His son was a pagan and hated Christianity. So according to the tradition, they hid the shroud. Abgar, knowing what his son was, had somebody to hide this image of Edessa, as it was known to them. And according to history, it was hidden away in a niche above the western gate of the city, carefully placed inside some kind of metal or lead casket, and remained there, was forgotten and remained there for 400 years. So they had a terrible flood in 525, destroyed most of the area there. And as they were trying to rebuild the city, tearing down the walls and so forth to rebuild it, they rediscovered the image of Edessa in 525. And as you see there, it was referred to as the image of Edessa, or the true likeness of Christ, not made with human hands. And so this is how that it was believed to be all of that time. By the way, that image there is one of the many images of Jesus that is believed to have been done by people who saw the shroud, because it changed dramatically how they presented him about this time. And so Akira Portus, I had to put that down there so I could pronounce it. That's a Greek word which means not made by human hands. And so whenever they talked about the image of Edessa, that's always the way they described it. This is something that was not made with human hands. This is the likeness of Christ, something touched by God for the purpose of touching others, they taught. Now, about this time, the Byzantine Empire came into existence a little bit earlier than this, and that's where it would eventually wind up. So one of the things they found in the research from the 6th century was this liturgy known as the Mozarabic Rite of the Holy Week. Now, why that's important is it says in it, and that's the front of the rite, it has a quote in there saying, Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. So in the 6th century, they're saying that this is what they saw. They saw, Peter and John saw the imprints, and I italicized that, the imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. So they're talking about that in the 500s. And it was brought to Spain by Arab Catholics, still used today in Toledo, Spain. So they began to find all of these writings and so forth, which indicated that the image of Edessa, what became known as the shroud, became known at one time as the Mandylion, was the same thing as the shroud. They would have called it something else, as you see. Now, in the mid-6th century, as I talked about, the images of Jesus began to change. Something caused that. Whenever you have a huge change in something, art or whatever, especially in something as important as the Christian religion, there's something that triggers that. And so the images of Jesus began to change in the 6th century. That had been the 500s. Before it had been a short-haired, clean-shaven shepherd, which you see on the right. Later, after this discovery of the the image of Edessa, they began to depict Jesus in art as a long-haired, bearded, serious, and older man. Something triggered that, because that was a huge change in art and in how they viewed it. And they always did it on linen. Now this is in Istanbul, Turkey. This is the Hagia Sophia. And it's now a mosque, because Turkey is a Muslim country and they have a president there named Erdogan, and he's crazy as they come. He believes that he's going to be the caliph of the newly established worldwide Islamic empire. And so this had been a church originally, built by the Byzantines, and for a while it was taken over by the Muslims, and some of the icons and imagery there was destroyed deliberately by the Muslims, but they decided to compromise and make it a museum. But when Erdogan came to power in 2020, he came before that, but in 2020 he had that changed back to a mosque. And it's one of the big mosques in Turkey now. Beautiful building. Of course, they got the minarets. I don't care for that. And the reason that's important, the Hagia Sophia, is because this is where the image of Jesus from the 5th century is. And you see it shows him as a fairly young, either he's got no beard or a very short beard. He's got very short hair. And that was in the 5th century. And in the same building from the 6th century, this is Jesus. Now, people have studied that imagery when it changed to this, and they can identify, not countless, but great numbers of similarities between the image of Jesus that started in the 6th century to what's on the shroud. And experts have looked at it, and they find more and more areas of similarity. So therefore, historians and researchers believe that the reason it changed this dramatically was because they saw the shroud, and the same one that's in Turin today. And there you see another one. That's known as the Sinai Christ Pantocrator from 531 AD. That's only 6 years after they rediscovered the image of Edessa. And it's believed to be based on the shroud because of the way his hair is, his beard is. One of the things that it looks like as you look at the shroud, the image in the shroud, is that he had large eyes. Now, they think that's for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into later, but they believe he had coins on his eyes, on his eyelids. And that's one of the things that made his eyes look bigger. And so you see in the artwork, see how large that the artists depict his eyes as being. And so most likely that's where they got their image. And realized that that's what it was, that's who it was. And there's just a comparison of Shroud of Turin with the Sinai Pantocrator. And they've studied that. You can see how narrow his nose is, how large his eyes look, the beard, the hair. And in some of those images, it even has some of these squiggly marks that on the shroud are blood. They even include some of that. And then they started minting coins, and this was minted in 692. First coins minted with the image of Christ by order of Emperor Justinian II, called a solidus. And as you see, he's got the long hair hanging straight down, which we'll touch on later, the beard, and so forth. And so experts who study that and make comparisons say that there's no doubt in their mind that image came from the shroud. Experts in art and physiology and so on. Then here's another one from 692 that they said had 180 points of congruence. Congruence means the same or similar. And they said it's better than fingerprints. And so you see again the man on the coin. The double line across the neck on the shroud is even included in this one. You know, I told you that that was folds, and you can see that they included the folds right there as early as 692 in these coins. Fascinating. Chemises. And then this is another Greek word, tetradiplum. Tetra means four in Greek. And that word, excuse me, that word means doubled in four. Now the reason that's important, excuse me, is because in this early art and in the early accounts of it, they just show the face of the man in the shroud. And so some people say, well, that can't be the shroud because it's just the face of the man. But with the folds that are in the shroud, they determined that they folded it for the purpose of storing it and for transporting it. And in this way, and you see on the right, that's how the shroud looks. And so Abgar's cloth showed the whole body, however, in the 8th century. And they believed it was because it was doubled in 4. And so there's how they doubled it. And here, Pope Stephen III in the 8th century, in the 700s, said Christ spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was white as snow. On this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most noble body has been divinely transferred. And this is from a pope in the 8th century. And so he reveals that even though the early artwork and the description of it just showed his face, that it was because they had folded it in a tetradiplum, as you see there. It's amazing how people can research that and make these determinations. But it's because they're very intelligent people, for one thing, and I believe it's also because the Holy Spirit's guiding it. He wants us to know it in these last days. So there's another example. The artwork, you see that this is an icon of King Abgar holding it. You only see the face on the shroud there. And so it's believed that in 644, as a matter of fact, an exact date of August the 16th, 944, the image of Edessa was moved from there to Constantinople. Now, Constantinople, which is the capital of Turkey today, as Istanbul, was a place where there was a great concentration of Byzantine Christians. Byzantinians were Christian. And they built great churches and so on, like the Hagia Sophia. And so in August the 16th of 944, the general of the imperial army presented the cloth from Edessa to Emperor Romanus. And there's a record of that, the specific date that occurred. The reason that he got the shroud on that date was because they had to move it again, because there was threats to destroy it or to take it or whatever by the Muslims. And so 260 years after that, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade, you know, to this day, the Muslims, particularly in the Arab world and in the Middle East, if they really want to degrade us, they call us crusaders. They hate crusaders. They don't forget anything. And in their history, you know about the Great Crusades, where they sent great armies from Europe to try to retake Jerusalem and all the holy sites because they were in the hands of the Muslims. And as you know, there were just countless numbers of people killed in those wars. And so in this 1204 crusade, they sacked, the French knights sacked Constantinople. This is known, this is well known, well documented in history. So the shroud was in Constantinople in 1204 and disappeared during this crusade. Well, it's pretty obvious. The French knights were sacking the city, taking anything they thought was valuable. So here again is a letter to Pope Innocent III in 1205 where they say as much. And they said, in April last year, a crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste to the city of Constantine. It was named after Emperor Constantine, Constantinople. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians petitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. And that is a documented letter that's in existence today that was written by one of the military commanders to Pope Innocent III. That is, by the way, Pope Innocent III there, an image of him. So here's another one they came up with in 1192, which is about 100 years before the earliest date according to the carbon-14 dating. It depicts the shroud in Constantinople. And it shows, it's a series of drawings. And they show the removing of Jesus' body from the cross. And there are no thumbs visible. You remember what I told you about driving the spikes through the carpal tunnel would do to the nerve, and it would draw the thumbs in? Well, when they drew this, the artist drew this 100 years before the earliest date under carbon-14 dating, you can see that it only shows his 4 fingers as they take him down from the cross. No thumbs are visible on the body. Thumbs prominent on all the others. And so once again, they believe that this artist had seen, or had certainly seen, depictions of the shroud. And then here's some more. The Hungarian Prey manuscript. Jesus wrapped in the shroud, it shows his face image. It shows a naked man, and that's the case. No thumbs visible. A herringbone weave, you see it there. And an L-shaped pattern of burn holes. Now, why that's so important is at some point prior to this, there had been a fire in which they had kept the shroud in a lead coffin, or casket as they called it, and some of the lead had melted in the heat and dripped on the folded up shroud. It's depicted here in these drawings 100 years before the earliest, and you see them there. See these L-shaped holes right here? The herringbone weave. So whoever drew that in 1192 had seen the shroud, or had seen at least a good depiction of the shroud. Burn holes in the L-shaped pattern. And so the shroud was in Constantinople prior to 1204 and dates back to at least 525. And of course, we're convinced it dates back to the time of Jesus' burial. And they show the herringbone weave and so on, as I said. And there's a better look at it, this drawing. The herringbone weave with the burn holes. Couldn't be anything else. It has to be that same shroud. And why was it so important to them? So here's some of the other historical writings that give us clues. From the Codex Vaticanus Latinus in the 10th century, that would have been the 900s, it was written, King Abgar received a cloth on which one can see not only a face, but the whole body. In the 6th century, somebody wrote, the divinely wrought image which the hands of men did not form. This is how they described it. The city of Edessa, in which there was preserved a blood-stained image of the Lord, not made by hands. 10th century, a moist secretion without pigment or painter's art. They're saying it's blood. 10th century, he was barely able to make out an outline. This was somebody who had seen it and was describing it. And then the overseer of the relic treasury in Constantinople prior to 1204 said, in this place the naked Lord rises again, and the burial linen can prove it. So all down through the centuries, these people were convinced, absolutely convinced, that that was the burial shroud of Jesus. And that's why they protected it so, like they did up until today. So that moves us up to this guy, and we'll touch on that some before we quit. Professor Jerome Lejeune. Obviously he's a Frenchman. And so he did a whole bunch of study on the common characteristics between the shroud and the Hungarian Prey manuscript. And here's some of the points of interest. He said the shroud is twice the length of the man. That's how it's depicted in both cases. A herringbone weave pattern, L-shaped pattern of holes on the back. The man had a beard and long hair. He could see his image clearly. A mark above the right eye corresponding to the reverse 3 shaped bloodstain on the shroud. It's in the Hungarian manuscript. The body is naked. The right hand is over the left. Long fingers, no thumbs. Nail wound on the wrist of the right hand. 3 nails used for crucifixion. This is the man in the shroud, the image of the man in the shroud, and also was included in the prayer manuscript, the Hungarian prayer manuscript. So here's some of the, sort of a summary of some of the history of the shroud. The large prominent burns occurred in 1532. That's when it was in Turin. The L-shaped burns were earlier. The burns from coals most likely spilled from a censer accidentally at an unknown time prior to 1290. A copy from Loret, France of a painting in 1516 shows the large burns from haven't occurred. The large burns from 1532 have not occurred yet. And the L-shaped burns patterns are prominently featured. You see it there. You see the burn patterns here and here. And you see how the man is depicted. His arms crossed, no thumbs, wounds in his wrists, etc. So we put it all together. The carbon-14 dating said it was 1260 to 1390. The things that disprove that are historical references, influence on ancient icon images that we covered, the Hungarian Prey manuscript, all point to one conclusion. The shroud dates to at least the 6th century, the same time as the Mozarabic Arabic rite of Holy Week. So what that tells us is why that's so important is, one, it totally destroys the carbon-14 dates that were given. They totally missed it, probably deliberately. And it takes us back to at least the 6th century. But that's when it was discovered in the gate, in the wall, in Edessa. And they believe it had been there for 400 years, so that takes us back to the 2nd century. So, is this the face of the Lord Jesus Christ? And as I've told you repeatedly, I believe yes it is, absolutely. And then Jewish burial practices, we'll touch on this briefly and we'll conclude for the night. And that's extremely important for a number of reasons that we understand. For one thing, John says in his gospel that they buried Jesus according to the methods of the Jews. So he tells us that he was buried in the manner of the Jews in the gospel. But there was confusion about exactly what the manner of the Jews in burial was back at that time. But this is from The Jewish Way of Death and Mourning by Maurice Lamb, published in 2012. He's now deceased. He was a well-known Jewish rabbi who studied these things. He says the Jewish tradition recognizes the democracy of death. It therefore demands that all Jews be buried in the same type of garment, a simple white shroud. Now, some people in modern times who have studied that, they say, well, we can't rely on what they do today. We have to know what they did in the 1st century. And so there's been much research done on that. And this is one of the men who contributed to that. Then, in John 19:40, as it says, they buried him as the manner of the Jews is to bury. God don't miss anything. He don't leave out anything. It's the only place it's mentioned. John talks more about the crucifixion, the burial, and so forth than anybody. So he goes on to say, Lamb goes on to say, where the deceased died through violence or accident, and his body and garments are completely splattered with blood, no washing or what he calls a tahara is performed. So in Jews' burials, if somebody dies of natural causes or whatever, they wash the body, wrap it in a shroud. They can either do it them naked or clothed, and they bury them. They try to bury them the same day, much like the Arabs do. That's where the Arabs got it. The Muslims got it. But if the person died a violent death and shed blood during his death, the blood has to be buried with them. So if you're familiar in Israel, when they have bombings and they have terrorist attacks, they have people who all they do is go out to the scene and gather up body parts of the Jews who have been killed. They even take what we call swatches and soak up the blood, and they bury it with the body. So therefore, why is there blood on this shroud of Jesus? Why is there blood on his body? Because he died a violent death. By the way, hopefully we'll get to talk about what they call mingled blood and why that's important. That's blood that he shed while he was still alive, and then blood that oozed from his body after he was dead. It's known as mingled blood, and it's unclean. So it has to be buried with the person, and if somebody touches that, they are ceremonially unclean. And if you touch any part of a dead body under Judaism, you're unclean ceremonially. So therefore the body is placed in this casket without the clothes being removed. Only a sheet is wrapped around it over the clothes. The blood is part of the body and may not be separated from it in death. So therefore they buried Jesus. Now there are people, and of course people come up with all kinds of theories, that there are people who say that when they study the shroud, they can see the crucifixion nails. Because the crucifixion nails, when they got him down from the cross, when they pulled him out, they would have had his blood and some of his tissue on them. So they believe they buried them with him too. Whether that can be proven or not, I don't know. Another fascinating part of that is that I've talked about here in some devotions is a while back they found 2 crucifixion nails in Caiaphas' tomb. Caiaphas was the high priest who condemned Jesus to death. Why would Caiaphas have crucifixion nails in his tomb? I'll let you think about that. It was bound in strips, according to John, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, according to Matthew, wrapped in linen, according to Luke. He bought fine linen, that's Joseph of Arimathea, took him down and wrapped him in the linen. So the logical synthesis is that the body of Jesus was bound at the hands and feet along with a chin bandage and then wrapped in a single linen shroud. That's how they would have buried him, his body, and we see it in the shroud. And they believe, too, as they study it, that his arms being crossed one over the other, I believe it's the left over the right, that being able to see the thumbs, it looks like his shoulders are kind of scrunched up. And they believe that's the way they tied it within the shroud. And see, so that's why when Peter and John walked in and saw that shroud, nothing had been disturbed. It would have been impossible to take the body out without loosening all of that. So I shared this with you before. This is Barry Schwartz. And he talked about his Jewish mother being from Poland. Had only a high school education. He heard one of his lectures after we were driving home. She was quiet for a long time, so I asked her, Mom, what do you think? She said, Barry, of course it's authentic. They wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it wasn't. So Barry Schwartz, Orthodox Jewish mother, agreed with him that it was the burial shroud of Jesus. Now what she thought about Jesus beyond that, but she has to be thinking about something seeing that image in the shroud. And so that's my time for the night. We'll stop there, and if we get back next week, we'll look at the composition of the linen. And by the way, I mentioned it this morning, and we'll hopefully get to it later, but when I said that there's scientific evidence of this, of the shroud coming from Jerusalem to Edessa, to Constantinople, to Lorraine, France, to Turin, Italy, they have countless pollen spores in the shroud that came from all those places. And so experts say that the shroud would have had to been in those places for those pollen spores to be there. And if we get to that, you'll be blown away, I believe, by some of those pollen shrouds they found. Some of it don't grow anywhere beyond 50 miles of Jerusalem. And there's a lot of them there. And it goes on and on. Any question or comment about that? Thoughts, corrections, challenges?
I think it is the shroud of Jesus, because from what all you've told us and shown us, I believe it is.
Yeah. And we ain't nowhere near all of it yet. It gets better and better. And yeah, I don't think there's any doubt at all. You know, for a long time I made my living doing criminal investigations. One of the big things we had to do was collect any physical evidence as well as circumstantial evidence and put all that together to come up with enough to try to convince a jury that this person committed this crime beyond a reasonable doubt. I never saw any crime, even when people confessed to it, that there was anywhere near the evidence you see here. It can't be anything else. From my perspective, it cannot possibly be anything else. Just the fact that that shroud from 2,000 years ago is still in existence, just that, is amazing. It had to be preserved by some supernatural power because there's not another one on the face of the earth. Now, they have found segments of linen shrouds from that time, but they're only segments that are withering away or rotting away. They have this whole shroud. It's in fairly good condition. even though it's been burned 3 or 4 times and other things, handles so much, travels so much. But there's only one. And this one that we just happen to have has blood stains, is of a crucified man who has blood stains, has this incredible image on it, is a crucified man who's been scourged with a crown of thorns on his head. There's no possibility that's anybody else, from my point of view. Thank y'all for coming, and we'll call it a night. And Ray, would you dismiss us, please?
Heavenly Father, Lord, we just come to you thanking you for all the many blessings of life. Lord, we thank you for the little things that we just take for granted each and every day. We thank you for allowing us to come together and study your word and study about your word. And we thank you for John and all the studying that he's doing, all the work that he's done to put these presentations together, Lord. And may we take it home with us, may we think about it, may we study it, may we look at it. Because, Father, we know that you're bringing this forth for a reason. And that reason is being that we don't serve a haphazard God. We're where we are every day of our life for a reason. And Father, I believe that with everything I believe. Lord, I just thank you that we have men like this that will teach your word and will stand for your word. And Lord, I would ask that you bless each and every family that's represented here tonight, or even those that couldn't be here for whatever reason. And again, thank you for all the things that you do for us. Forgive us for all of our many sins. Bless us in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.